Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are in the world, and welcome to this Techstrong Learning Experience brought to you by Mezmo. My name is Cody, and I'm the host of Techstrong Learning. We've got an exciting presentation ahead. First, before we begin, I have just a couple of housekeeping notes to cover. Today's session is being recorded, so if you miss any of our discussion, perhaps you'd like to rewatch or share with a friend. The on-demand recording will be made available shortly after our live session concludes. If you look to the right side of the screen, you'll notice there are a couple of options for you to engage with us. The first of which is the chat tab. I'd like you to go ahead and start warming up that chat tab for me by letting me know from where you are tuning in. If you have any questions for us, we'd like you to go ahead and send those in to the Q&A tab, which is directly to the right of the chat. We will be sharing the presentation slides after the program concludes, so keep an eye out in your email for those to make it your way. And of course, before we close out, we are giving away 4 $25 Amazon gift cards. So the topic of our discussion today is taming data complexity at scale with observability pipelines. And I'm joined by Joshua Scott, Senior Product Manager at Mezmo. Josh, thanks so much for being here with me. I'm going to let you go ahead and take it from here.
Awesome. Thank you, Cody. And welcome, everybody. It's an exciting day to talk about data complexity. I'm going to introduce a little bit about where I come from and talk a little bit about Mezmo first to make sure everybody has context regarding what we're going to discuss. So as Cody mentioned, I'm product manager at Mezmo. I'm specifically responsible for our telemetry pipelines solutions. And I've had a background in cyber as well as IT automation and mostly in the product management realm as well as some of the solutions engineering. And Mezmo, which was formerly LogDNA, we rebranded last year, is really focused on helping organizations get more value from their telemetry data. We've traditionally focused a lot on logs, but we were expanding obviously to other areas like metrics, traces, as well as the pipelines. So we're going to be actually focused on a lot of the areas we're going to talk about today. Now, quick primer. As far as when you get terminology, it can be very confusing to understand what does it mean. When we say observability, a lot of people will end up using that term interchangeably, but what we're really going to be talking about today is telemetry. And that's data where there's traces, metrics, and logs. It's not necessarily all of observability. And I pulled this from Gartner just to give everyone a quick primer as far as what it is that some of these other terminologies can mean. Everybody's probably familiar with the application performance monitoring. Observability gets a lot of the attention these days because it's been top of mind, but it does go beyond logs, metrics, and traces generally when you talk about observability. So telemetry is more of a subset. And we have some additional areas here that are coming up, data observability, as well as observability-driven development, things where they're leveraging some of the insights from observability beyond just telemetry, right? You're getting data that's coming from other sources that could be useful, could be leveraged as a part of a feedback loop, and open telemetry, which is a movement specifically around being able to manage telemetry data and using open source tools that would help with that. So all these terms are going to be something that to keep in mind. I'm going to be talking primarily, though, about telemetry throughout the presentation. And when I say anything with pipelines, I'm going to be referring to it in the context for now of telemetry. So with that, let's talk about the landscape of what's going on within the data sphere today. When you look at applications, especially, the number of new applications that are being developed is pretty astronomical. There's going to be 500 million new applications deployed within the next 5 years. It's a lot of data that's going to be coming off those. The data growth is 23% compound annual, so it's continually increasing at a very quick rate. And in the meantime, for businesses, there's some bad news, which is the compliance costs are increasing, as well as security costs from the security threats that the organizations have to manage are increasing. And in the other side of the organization, the actual resources to handle these challenges are either dwindling or barely maintaining with the IT budget. The number of applications monitored, though, is actually going down, surprisingly, and that's primarily because of that growth. The percent of employers who are struggling also to hire people who are skilled is very high. So there's basically a lot of data coming, a big wave, and there's not enough resources to handle it. So organizations are going to have to figure out new ways, and that's where the data complexity comes in, because there's a lot more data, a lot of new data, and there's really not a lot of great ways to handle it in terms of what it's going to be like within the next few years. So For an organization, I've seen a couple of different ways organizations go about this, but the primary way that I've so far seen a lot of organizations is they dump it into a big pile. And so where they're looking at all this data and they're trying to say, hey, maybe I can take it and I can put it somewhere. It can just be something that I look into the insights after the fact. The challenge being that there's so much data now that you can't store it. And you also have this numerous set of tools, tool sprawl, where you're trying to analyze all this data and make sense of it. That's really difficult challenge. And this XKCD joke here was, in my mind, very accurate in terms of what I've seen in a lot of cases where they try to dump it into a giant data lake and then try to pull out the insights later. It's oftentimes very challenging because the data is already messy by the time it gets there, and it's not easy to clean it, and it's not easy to actually then use it. So you end up making sense of it only within the context of, well, what do I really want to see out of it? I'll make it look like that. It doesn't usually result in any kind of new valuable insights, though. So there needs to be a new way to be able to make sure that those insights are coming out before you get it into the pile. Now, the real translation to what it means for the DevOps side, though, is where the implications become more interesting, because a DevOps already is in general overworked and underpaid. And the way that most of the time I've seen DevOps teams working is they're really hard pressed to keep up applications, especially given the number of issues and potentially if there's outages, especially they're always on call. So they're already spread thin. You're probably already spread thin. And the organization has to get the insights still that is the necessary insights to essentially keep away from the compliance issues, security issues, and to keep uptime. So there can't be any gaps. And then, of course, with uptime becoming something that's important for maintaining at an application level to get the revenue for the business, it's always going to be a priority. So essentially, I would change this cartoon over here to say, it's really DevOps that's maintaining a lot of the primary infrastructure for organizations nowadays. Most organizations are based upon technology and they're based upon apps, especially, and a lot of the economy is. So organizations really need to be thinking about this in addition to DevOps themselves being able to actually have the tools necessary to start dealing with the onslaught of data. Now, the DevOps specific problems, there's many of them here where we can start breaking them into what are the different cases. And then these are specific to telemetry. I know that in DevOps, there's quite a few wide-ranging areas of problems. It's not just telemetry, but I'll be focused here on the ones for telemetry. A lot of times, companies have so much data, or apps are spitting off so much data that they don't have very much value. So they're trying to figure out how to sift the signal from the noise. Common problem, has been around for a while. And usually there might be an attempt to clean it up only to realize that the data has changed over time. And then you have to go back and try to do it again. Also, many times within organizations where you have numerous dev teams and many different applications, each application often is its own special flower. And they think that their specific data, of course, has to be a certain way because that's the way it should be. And that's the opinionation coming through that ends up causing challenges for downstream when you're trying to leverage that data outside of just the existing team. So for many people, the way that they talk to the development team, they'll have a specific convention, but where they develop that convention is maybe potentially not exactly a great reasons as to why, but DevOps still usually has to deal with it. Now, also DevOps, there's a favoritism towards automation, and for sure anything in the IT and technology space, automation is a great thing and it helps scale people. But one thing that we've noticed is that in beginning, automation always starts out as a project to help reduce the overall workload and make it so that things are so much easier. But by the time you get to the completion and deploying of an automation, many times it actually ends up adding more overhead than what it actually solved because you have to manage it ongoing. So there's a challenge there with the double-edged sword. You can automate, but you can only automate so much before you need to make sure that the automation is really focused around what you really have to automate, not just necessarily making everything automated in every task. So, and the last problem being that in many cases, we're already as individuals dealing with more than 10 to 15 tools on a daily basis. And the tool stack is growing so much that in some cases there's 20 or 30 tools that are being leveraged within the tool stack for DevOps. It's too many tools, frankly. A lot of times people are struggling just being able to keep those tools themselves running, let alone be able to use the tools and many of the tools themselves often get neglected. So all of these problems really compound when you have that huge amount of data coming. So it's difficult. We got to be able to address each one of these problems in its own way. And those are the things we'll talk about a little bit later in the presentation. Now, there are some existing solutions out there for being able to aggregate a lot of the data. They do centralize the data and they attempt to essentially make sense. This is the first generation, if you will, or I would call them first, but they're more the older generation that observability really started with these. And the way that they work by providing this essentially giant place to store your data and then house it and then allow you to query it, it certainly is helpful in certain cases, especially troubleshooting and in some cases monitoring. They also tend to somewhat lock you into their specific requirements as far as what their specific vendor sphere needs. And that could be a challenge for organizations because if you have so much data, it's either going to be too expensive to store it all in one place, or you need to be able to have multiple tools anyways to be able to get the insights because each one does its own thing. So it becomes its own problem. They're not necessarily the only way that you can then solve the problem. They could be a part of a solution, but they're not the end-all, be-all solution. Now, there's other tools as well that have been developing, and some of these have been around for a little bit of time. Some of the new products within the space for being able to build out data pipelines, for instance, or telemetry pipelines here on the left. And then there's open source tools, which actually some of these tools, they're fairly new in their infancy, but there's a lot of good things that are coming out from them. And some of them are a little bit older, NiFi, of course, being out for some time, and Fluent being out for quite a bit of time, over a decade now. So they've evolved. So we've got multiple options for how you can go. The big challenge between all of these is that in the vendor side, of course, you're dealing with the trying to lock you in at sometimes, or potentially their specific use cases for what they do within the point-to-point, meaning that they support them within the UI and they may not necessarily have an easy way to configure. And the open source is something that usually you have to build it yourself. There's a do-it-yourself element. Sometimes that can be good, but again, going back to the challenge of maintaining automation, anything new in your tool stack that's got to be maintained can be challenging. And the most difficult part usually about the open source tools is that it's hard to scale them. It's very expensive to scale and support to maintain those, especially things like NiFi. Some organizations that we work with, for instance, are using NiFi as a backbone for a lot of their logs. And there's a huge cost there just to maintaining and leveraging that tool. So what is the situation, though, that a lot of the organizations are dealing with, right? If we look at the telemetry situation and we break it into the specifics, I mentioned that there are oftentimes trying to approach it as a data lake problem, for example, wouldn't solve the problem. And what ends up happening usually is the organizations are trying to figure out what's going on within the development side. Development teams are sending their data out. That data gets maybe pushed all to a SIM, a data lake, and maybe some metric storage, maybe a Prometheus or something like Fauna. And then all of that data then is trying to get made sense of, but it's already a big ball by the time it gets there because, again, of the situation where every app is its own special flower, or some of that data, for instance, it's too much data, it's extraneous noise. So organizations struggle to be able to actually really understand it, but they're then dealing with this problem in multiple areas for every different team that's using these tools. Very challenging. Now, it's a simple fix if you say, well, yeah, that's obvious problem, Josh. We've all seen this problem and it's pretty normal, but you can put it into a couple of key steps, right? First, you can untangle the data prior to it being stored. Then you can just say, hey, well, let me act on that data while it's in flight so that it doesn't go into a pile and get all messy. And then I'll just monitor it from there and boom, I'm done. There's glory after this. But it's not that simple. I wish it was, but there are so many different problems and facets to being able to do it that it becomes a challenge. And we're going to talk a little bit about some of the problems, mostly in the preparation, even before you get there as a first step. Now, one thing to make clear, even though we're going to talk about some of the things that you can do, there's no silver bullets in this. There's usually always the idea that somehow if you come at it with just some new idea that somehow it'll immediately fix itself. No, it won't. There definitely can be improvements from changing, though, an approach. And the key thing that is really important in this context is that we need to consider things from a stream. Now, the other solutions we talked about, for instance, if you look at something like a Splunk, right, those are solutions that are dealing with storage. If we look at the things we've talked about so far, there's a larger amount of data coming. There's no way that it's going to be feasible to store it all because of the cost. It's also hard to make sense of it once it's stuck in some large data lake or trying to extract it later. So you've got to be able to move ahead of it. So it's somewhat like something of a phrase of a shift left, right? If you've heard that phrase before and being used in security, but this is more, hey, in your data analysis, you really need to think about how do you shift it into stream before it gets to whatever destination. You're still going to need the insights from the tools that you have. There's not necessarily a magic bullet to getting rid of those or doing anything that is going to eliminate them. But in the general context, the more that you can do in stream, the better off that you'll be. And then the longer term, even as the data continues to grow, you're going to be more equipped to scale within that stream as opposed to trying to do it later. So if you look at that change in approach, what does it really look like? This is how we illustrate it, and talk a little bit about some of the use cases that we see with some of the tools that you may have in your environment and sources that you may have. For instance, there are cases where observability use cases where you might want to be able to actually take some of the data from various sources and move it into a specific set of destinations and separate it out. Maybe you want to take and peel off metrics and put them into your metrics tools. Your logs may go into something for security, while maybe for your SREs, you may send some data to Datadog or something else that they're using to actually monitor. So doing these kinds of cases in stream, though, you're really going to be looking at normalizing that data, filtering and reducing it before it ever gets to these destinations. Another case for security and compliance types of use cases, you've really got to be able to do redaction. You need to be able to drop things and making sure that the data streams of the actual trend, the data itself, is being adhered to from a compliance perspective. We've had cases where, for instance, account IDs or other sensitive information that's being put into the logs is needed for one team, is not needed for another. You need to redact that information before it goes to the final destination, but you need to be able to do that before it ever gets to that destination. It's too hard to do it after. And then finally, there's analytics use cases. And because of the amount of data, the number of metrics that oftentimes apps and other tools are spitting off, to be able to make sure that the downstream destinations are effective in terms of what they deliver for the insights, you need to be able to aggregate that data before, especially if there's enough volume, but also the uniqueness of the way that you tag that data or label that data can often become a problem. It's too many tags, for instance, can overwhelm the ability to make sense out of the metrics. So you got to make sure that you limit that. And that's hard to do when it's purely in stream. All of these things could be done potentially in specific point cases at the destination, but with the volume of data becoming so big, it's really going to be difficult in the long term, as we see it, to make sure that that actually works and stays working. So that's where we have telemetry pipelines. The pipelines being an idea that you should be able to treat your data in the stream, and as it goes along, you can operate on it at scale in near real time before it ends up reaching the destination. But it's something that's not easy to implement. Data pipelines have been a concept for some time, and the main challenge being, of course, that they're a multi-pronged effort to actually get to work. You could choose a specific solution, but that solution has to be bought in by all stakeholders. Now, in this case that we're talking about here, to being able to get telemetry data, let's assume across a number of different apps and sources of data within an organization, the organization has to buy in. The apps themselves need better instrumentation from the development side so that they're coming out with the right metrics, traces, and logs. The DevOps teams here, which is the most pertinent, what we talk about for this case, for this particular presentation, they need ways to be able to scale and act on that data in stream that's easily maintainable. And they need to make sure that the approaches that they're taking don't add more resource intensive overhead. Organizations really need to consider how they standardize. And that's something that sometimes DevOps needs to drive, just because the organizations may not totally understand. And standardizing meaning that they should have some standards for what applications should adhere to help reduce some of the app as a special flower. And then finally, really the main thing that organizations need to consider is that there's a need for a broker for the data. In a lot of cases, each team is doing their own thing. They don't end up having some kind of a central way to be able to arbit the different teams and coordinate that. So they have to make sure to consider it. And usually DevOps is in a good spot to be somewhat of that, as long as the organization is willing to make sure that they're empowered. But this is where you can get ahead, right? In terms of making sure from an impact perspective, DevOps teams have an opportunity to make sure that they can start getting where they need to be. In some of these cases, they'll be waiting for the organizations to catch up. Now, one thing that you have to do when you're putting in any kind of a telemetry pipeline or any data pipeline in general, really, these are questions that need to be answered. You have to make decisions around how to do it. And a lot of times the decisions in the preparation of defining what you need to do for the pipeline is more difficult than the work itself once you have it all in place. First of all, you got to make sure you understand how you're going to host it and you're going to do it yourself. Or what is the tool set basically that you need to do to make sure to help support it. And where do you need your flexibility? In some cases, flexibility might need to come from the collection of the data. In some cases, the flexibility needs to come more from how you actually transport the data and do your logic in the transport. Another key question that often we even internally are looking at this constantly and asking ourselves is that, well, their open source tools are really mature enough, because some of the new tools that are coming out, they're still pretty new. There's pros and cons to them, but they are evolving quickly. But that's one thing for many organizations that have a need that has to be filled right now. They may not be able to wait for some of those open source solutions. And then the last piece really that gets missed a lot of times in terms of how do you do anything with a pipeline is how do you measure, test, and monitor it ongoing. And often that ends up causing more of the long-term overhead and the difficulty, because you can set up the pipeline, but the challenge becomes maybe that's just a whole bunch of duct tape and glue to make sure it works. And how does it keep going when your data changes underneath it, or you have these new apps coming, new data volume, etc. And moving in stream can also require new things that you would do deploying locally for new collectors, for example. And how do you make sure that those local collectors can scale with the tools that you have, and making sure that you actually can visualize some of it. A lot of the times that open source itself, for instance, doesn't have great visualization capabilities, which makes it much harder to manage the pipelines themselves if you don't really understand how it looks and where there's a potential problem or pinpointing that. But once you've deployed a pipeline, you really have a hard time making the changes retroactively. I mean, the good news is that the data is constantly new data because it's flowing through in real time. But the challenge being that if you make one tweak and it causes a major issue in a downstream system, now you might be setting yourself back and having to go through a painful recovery process. So in general, as telemetry pipelines are a different beast, I'm going to talk through some of these questions and help elucidate what we're thinking as far as the solutions. This is a little bit biased, obviously, because I'm a vendor too. So I've tried to make sure, though, at least I pose the questions in a way that is as unbiased as possible. Now, in terms of the self-managed solutions, if we're talking about, for instance, you want to take an open source tool and then be able to leverage that tool, deploy it internally, you're going to really have to consider how do you manage your own infrastructure. And maybe if you've gotten everything in your applications on Kubernetes, it would not be that hard. But if you have any kind of legacy applications, or meaning that maybe they're running on VMs or they're not necessarily brought up to the latest in the infrastructure capabilities, you probably are going to have a harder time. But also, if you try to just directly export all of the data to SaaS, it can be too costly. There can be egress costs that we've heard from our customers where they can't send everything just because of the general cost of it. They need to be able to do some of the processing within the environment that they're in, rather than just dumping it all out. So really what I think personally is the most realistic is a hybrid approach. And that's really where you have to process some of the data close to origination, maybe do some of the redaction or things that especially will matter for your compliance, and offload to SaaS for scale. And in that view, what it really comes down to is managing a lot of the first mile of the collection, and then making sure that you can fall back to a vendor that potentially, for instance, offers some kind of scale. And many of the even open source now are starting to develop their own ways to be able to, maybe there's a vendor that, for instance, provides a cloud solution as an option. But one thing that always is funny from my perspective when looking at some of the XKCD comics that I've embedded on here, how fragile a lot of these really modern systems are. And it seems so easy to have them break, because even if you look at some of the cases of like AWS going down, right, I think there's a lot of complexity in everything that we've got today. And generally every organization is struggling with this question of how much do they do in their own environment versus how much do they do outside, where they still could potentially be subject to other people's uptime requirements. Now, one thing that at least as far as being able to decide how do you approach your first mile, we've seen that the open source movement, as I said, while it's not mature, it definitely has got a lot of momentum behind it. And in general, while some of the things that they're fixing are not always necessarily specific to, let's say, a business itself, an organization needs, they're moving quickly. And then that is going to provide, I think, in the future, some pretty good options. Many companies are still working with a combination, though, of agents that are maybe proprietary agents, and then also with open source. But I think that the sooner that any company can start with defining the open source collection strategy, the better. Those are going to be things that I think will make a lot of sense to be able to make sure you deploy and manage yourself when they're on the endpoints. Those are something that generally, even though there may not be mature today, if you run it in parallel, for example, and start it right now, you may not need to rely on it now, but you can start testing it. And then eventually, as the maturity of those tools begins to increase, you'll be able to get to the point where you can leverage it more fully as the complete solution for your first mile collection. And it reduces the vendor dependence. So that way that as you know, things change, a lot of the things, the standards that are being developed, specifically like open telemetry, for example, they do have some really great features, and they're going to only get better as they go. Now, one thing that we've heard, particularly from feedback from our customers, is oftentimes the need for code. And I mentioned that, you know, flexibility needs to be chosen. And one thing that a lot of times doesn't get considered enough, especially given the resource constraints, is how much overhead it can take to manage code and how much you need to actually have in place. And this is especially true if you're doing something entirely open source, like being able to, let's say, deploy an entire set of vector endpoints and put them together in a pipeline. There's a lot of complexity actually in that, even though each individual configuration file might be relatively straightforward. It's more about the interplay between them. And without anything that lets you visualize it, it can be very challenging to maintain, because a lot of the more challenging things are just maintaining the basics at times, making sure that things are updated correctly for specific configuration values. So it's really something to consider a lot, that what is it that you need to make sure that you can code or have the flexibility to do code with, and what do you not? One note that's important, by the way, is none of the open source solutions for building pipelines or collecting them are actually offering any kind of a GUI. I mean, you could argue NiFi has something with the ability to see some of your processors, but it's really not necessarily built primarily for the pipelines. It's more of a partial use case that you can use NiFi to build out. Now, if you look at the full list of the open source solutions and you wanted to do it yourself, there's a fair amount of pros and cons to each. With NiFi, I mentioned that it does have the visual interface, which is great for a programming context. So we have some customers that are using NiFi, and they have specific processor templates, and then they actually deploy those within their organization. But they have a whole team just dedicated to maintaining and scaling NiFi and trying to continually keep the other teams using it. And that can get to be quite a bit of a challenge. And they had to build a lot of it themselves, because there's very little off-the-shelf stuff in NiFi for telemetry. Certainly, you can fit into that shoe if you want to, but you might spend a lot of time doing it. Fluent is making some great progress in terms of, I think, some of their content from the community. They've been around for a while. They have some good off-the-shelf kind of capabilities for both sources and destinations, though it can be a little bit then hodgepodge. There's something that's always the case with open source, as far as can you find somebody that maybe solved the problem for you, and how much does that specific solution that they've implemented work. The big challenge, of course, with a lot of these, not just Fluent, but is that it's really challenging to be able to scale it necessarily by itself if you're trying to do it all yourself. And all of these are essentially, in every case, managed through configuration files except NiFi. So it ends up becoming a bit of a pain. There is a good news about Fluent, is that there is a Docker container you can download to do some testing with, but it doesn't really test anything with regards to scale. That's a specific challenge. For the open telemetry, it's got lots of momentum behind it, well supported. The main thing that we see there's some limited transformation capabilities. Everybody's either contributing some of their own for their specific needs, and those can be a little spotty. Therefore, you end up with maybe writing some of it yourself. However, just from a pure collection standpoint, it's actually doing pretty well in terms of getting more mature. And Vector The newest of all of these pretty much, but it does have some really great capabilities within it. We have a number of customers that have deployed Vector, for instance, inside of their environments for some of the collection. And that's where they have great support for sources and destinations, which makes it easy to be able to use it as a collector. However, it's difficult to actually run the actual pipelines through it, because in many cases you're ending up stitching together configuration files, unless you are purchasing from a vendor, Datadog, for instance, which is the one that primarily does anything with visualization for it. And also, one thing to note is that Vector's new versions are at 0.27 now, so they're changing quite frequently, and there can be breaking changes within some of those new releases that they've had, and that can be a challenge to manage. So out of these do-it-yourself solutions, you've got quite a few options. It's more about then evaluating the individual capabilities of each one and defining the pros and cons around how you want to be able to use it. The good news being, though, that especially in the case of these three here, right, you get a lot of variety of the sources and destinations, which does help reduce some of your lock-in. Now, off-the-shelf solutions, I'm just comparing here with some of the ones that I had previously. Mezmo, we've just recently been working on the telemetry pipelines, and by just recently, I mean we started in last year. About a year now, we've been building out our telemetry pipeline solution. So we're still early on in the sense that we're just about to be able to go to a more public capability set of trialing, but we're really focused on building out the functionality that the users need based upon some of these challenges that you were just seeing. The good thing about what we've done is we've really focused on first making it a SaaS so that it's easy to manage for you and making that the scale not of something of a challenge. We have the built-in log analysis capabilities from when we were log DNA. That's still around. That's our biggest part of our organization still. So we really have the capabilities to be able to do storage and search well. And then we also have the visualization and the ability to see all this data live. If you look at some of the other vendors, the Cribble solution, for instance, they can do some pretty cool things with some of the logs. They did start off at on-prem, so they have an on-prem option as well as a SaaS. They do let you see things live, but they don't have a storage option. So if you wanted to be able to store the data with them, you're not going to be able to. You'd have to send it off. They're coming out with some search capabilities to let you actually sift through the data. And then they don't have any visualization directly of the pipelines. You can see some of the ways that the rules are set up, et cetera. But it's not a single pipeline visualization that you can easily understand what's happening usually. At Delta, they've really focused on how to make it as automated as possible when you're setting up a pipeline. There's pros and cons to that, but they are a SaaS offering, but they have a specific client you can, of course, deploy as on the edge. They do have some live tap capabilities, and they search and store on S3. They don't necessarily have their own dedicated storage database like we do. It's a little different, but they can still search. The visualization of the configuration, it's a little bit different than what you would do. A lot of what we've seen is usually still modifying it through configuration files. The Calyptia capabilities, which Calyptia, if you're not familiar, by the way, was founded from the folks who originally conceived of Fluent, and now have an organization on top of it for FluentD and FluentBit, that is. And they can do logs, metrics, traces. They also have a cloud offering now, Calyptia Cloud, which does SaaS, which lets you do some visualization of your pipelines as well as see the data that's flowing through it. But they don't natively themselves do storage or search. They would rely on you to get that from an external solution from some other vendor. So this is just a quick overview. Obviously, I'm biased, but I'm trying to make sure that I present at least here some of the key features. If you look at these, of course, versus the open source, a lot of the things that you're going to see through this area, the deployment, live tap, storage, search, those won't be native with any of the open source solutions if you're trying to build something. That's just something to keep in mind. Now, all right, let's say we've to make some decisions. You might have chosen, hey, well, I'm already doing something with one of the open source solutions, or I'm maybe thinking about it. The other parts that I have to think about, even if I've chosen a specific tool to use, will be how will you test? And this is one thing that I think a lot of times gets missed with looking at the telemetry pipeline specifically. How do you really test it for both how it's going to work as well as how it's going to scale? And it is actually a pretty challenging problem to test pipelines, and meaning like that if you're trying to stitch together a lot of different data and then show that you can actually handle that data and do all the transformation or all the different things you need to do to it while it's in stream and prove it, and then make sure it's working ongoing, there can be a lot of work just in that specific part. A lot of the vendors themselves, we build in, of course, some testing automation so that it makes it easier. But if you're doing open source, you're going to need to have some kind of a sandbox. The Docker version of Fluent does have some capability to help at least show that the functionality is working, but you will still be having to do some scale testing, which is where a lot of times people can run into some challenges. It's really verifying that scalability. And you really don't want it to be something where you do all the work to get it implemented and then find out that once you get the data in at scale, you're following the second law of thermodynamics, where it's dumping into a hodgepodge that's unusable, right? You've got to make sure that this part is planned out, in my mind, before you actually go through implementation, to make sure and verify that the solution is going to work for you and based upon the way that it's been defined and built and deployed. Now, monitoring is another piece where if you're going open source route, they don't really have any native monitoring. They can sometimes, they can spit off, like Vector can spit off logs and metrics. It can actually then use those metrics for something like a Grafana if you want to be able to put it downstream and then do some monitoring. In terms of the amount of monitoring, there's still things that are gaps there in the way that that's being done in terms of how they actually monitor, and especially relative amount of computation effort that's going in. That can be something that's not easy to monitor at all. So you still end up having to build some of this yourself, regardless of which open source solution, to be able to actually check on it and make sure. The key thing there being that's quite a bit of maintenance to be able to monitor it ongoing. Open telemetry is also pretty early. It's probably actually the least mature out of all of them in terms of its monitoring. It does have some extensions that have been put forward that will help with it. Hopefully those will evolve and become better, especially for the collector side as it grows. But overall, if you're not going to use an off-the-shelf solution, you're probably going to be doing quite a bit of monitoring yourself. And that's another piece of work that needs to be planned. Okay, those are a lot of different parts of what needs to be considered before you even get started with the telemetry pipeline. So before we even get to a solution, right, we've got to make a lot of decisions. And that's where I mentioned this was going to be something where we at least provide some of that. Here's what to think about before you get to it. But now we actually talk a little bit about the solution itself. So let's assume you've made the decisions, you've chosen a specific solution. What is it that you would need to do to actually solve the 4 challenges that I mentioned from the DevOps side? Well, it turns out once you've got all of this in place, it can be pretty quick and easy. So in spite of not being a simple silver bullet, there are some really fundamental building blocks that need to be inside of the pipeline functionality that you choose. And those building blocks are illustrated here. I've just made sure to make sure they're very clear and easy to understand. You really need to make sure that when you consider your strategies, right, what are you going to be doing with the data? A lot of what you're going to end up doing is choosing where to route data and maybe sending it to more than one place, but maybe in slightly different formats to each place. And also making sure that you know how to do the transformation. The transformation meaning like you may need to be able to normalize the data, for instance, in the case specifically of treating each app as its own special flower. You would want to make sure that those normalization capabilities are something that's available. There's multiple ways you can do this. For instance, in OpenTelemetry, you can write a script and then put that script in, and as different code options there's there. Plus, there's already some open source transformation functionalities that are available out there in the open source community. So those can help. Those are managing the code, of course. In cases like Cribble, for instance, you can use a little bit of a combination of both JavaScript as well as the ability to use the GUI to help manage those. In our tool, it's similar. We have a GUI to be able to manage it, and similar to what you would also do in the Calyptia. So once you get the transformation, though, the real key goal is to making sure that the input and the output are defined, and that way you can make sure the normalization adheres to whatever specific standards you might have. So once you have that, how do you reduce your noise, right? Taking that data volume down. So a number of different ways that we've used both internally and then also some of the customers we work with there's different ways you can actually reduce the total amount of logs. That's first key, is making sure you can reduce the noise. Some customers in the past, right, they've been dropping 90-95% of their data just because they don't have the ability to go through it. That isn't necessarily a great solution because you do miss out on visibility, but you will need to drop some of it, of course. So the question is, how do you make sure to sift out what is low value, what's high value? You can use routing to be able to actually help do that. So one strategy that works for customers that we work with is being able to take and route based upon conditions, which individual app has these particular types of parameters. And maybe there's a group of apps that behave similarly. You can route them all through the same case and then use conditions to be able to define when does that data go to, say, an S3 bucket, where maybe you store the low value and then you can keep the high value going to your SIM or some other solution, for example. Now, cases that we've seen specifically is being able to leverage the contents of events, for instance, to be able to then get into the details of the message using operations, and then use if this then type else conditions to be able to change where it goes. Also, if you get more sophisticated, and by the way, almost everybody does based on log level already, but I mentioned that for posterity's sake. And in some cases, we have seen where customers are not aware, for instance, that a switch was flipped inside of their apps, and then suddenly they're spending a lot more money trying to store their debug data because it got added to the log production log level somehow, and then it's spewing out. So it's one thing that I mentioned, though, just to make sure it's clear that you can always protect against that if you have the right pipeline capabilities in play. And the more sophisticated capabilities, which usually get to evolving to these over time, there's sampling and aggregation. Sampling being that you can potentially take the number of logs and reduce by just taking a fraction of them, not dropping them entirely, but say maybe making sure that 1 out of every 10 that comes in, maybe if the metrics or the logs is what makes it through, and then use it as a representative sample so that you can still keep an eye, but not necessarily completely remove. Aggregating metrics, of course, is something that needs to be done usually because of the level of detail in metrics oftentimes, and making sure that those are aggregated in the appropriate format so then they make sense, right, if they're summed or potentially taking absolutes, etc. Now, deduplication and reducing are things that are a little bit more difficult to implement because you need specific conditions under which you want to actually choose when to dedupe. A lot of times that you might hear like, oh, it's something that it can be done automatically. And certain vendors, and I won't name them, but they claim that. But I think that the real challenge is that a lot of times every company's got their own data, not just every app. And it's difficult to be able to say there's a one-size-fits-all solution. What you can do is make sure that there are particular cases where you might know keywords or things that you can observe over time and then match on, so that you can choose to be able to filter out logs that are particularly matched to a specific criteria that maybe, for instance, parts of the event message are similar, or they might have some kind of contains patterns, and then compare those. So capabilities there would make it easier as being able to match or ignore on certain fields, and making sure, of course, that they're all parsed even before they get to that step is important. And that's one thing that's also part of any solution, needs to make sure that these are parsed or they're not even going to be addressable. So once you've, let's say, done the bulk removal and you've taken out some of the trash and you start removing that, the next step is making sure to do the transformation. So we talked about this already a little bit. It starts, though, in my mind, with even making sure from that organizational side that there's some standards in play. JSON logging is coming more into favor. Not all apps, of course, have caught up to that. Or if they're using something with the open telemetry, for instance, as a way that they're subscribing to a specific standard, it really helps if there is one, even if not everybody is on it, because if you start to talk about it early, it's going to take a few years for it to actually penetrate through all the teams, but eventually it'll get there. The key thing is that by standardizing, or at least advertising the standards on the DevOps side, promoting something from your team can oftentimes end up leading to an adoption down the road, and making sure that the dev teams also are aware, even if it's not something that's totally enforceable. That's usually the challenge that many companies come into is how do you enforce standards? But at least advertising the standards or defining some and deciding on them can really at least get the start. And then once you have that ball rolling, you can still do the transformation where you need to. Being able to move fields, one thing that I've recommended was if, especially in a lot of cases, if you have custom fields that are coming in the logs, that you need to be able to remove those and then potentially take them out. And that's something where you can actually put them into, for instance, a specific part of the logs. So take all your custom fields out, move them into something like a meta object, and then you can, in your pipeline, choose to reduce that and remove it before you go to a destination, or you could choose to leave it depending upon which destination, but it makes it very easy to reference it because then you know that this is all the custom stuff that I put in the meta. Another case that I didn't write on here, but is pretty straightforward and standard, is the cardinality of your tags or labels on your metrics. We do have capabilities on our side to be able to reduce those. Some of the other vendors do too. It's a matter of which approach you want to take or which particular labels you want to keep. But setting a limit for the cardinality is something that's obviously valuable for making sure that the metrics, once they reach downstream destination, are according to what you really want and need. And maybe removing all of the extra host names or IDs that come into those, for instance, is an important way. A question that just came in. Are going to show the product in use, and actually not today. I was hoping to provide everybody with some information as far as what you can do and how you can do it, but we will be doing a follow-up. There will be information that's sent out. If you would like to get a demo, we're happy to take you through the product. Since we haven't, we're doing some testing right now, I was going to say, and we're working with individual customers and folks that are interested in it. So if you are interested, please reach out. One thing that is then addressing the automation overhead. So if you look at where those particular points of flexibility are needed, one thing that we've noted, it's something that the code should really be reserved for business logic as much as you can. A good friend of mine used to say, and so still does actually, that 90% of code is usually plumbing, and the 10% that's the business logic is the real value that comes in. And especially this is true, right, for any solution with the pipelines as well. If you can reserve scripting for your complex logical conditions, and then choose, depending on which solution you choose, particular languages obviously can be better suited for that kind of a case, which helps to make sure that you make the right choice. One thing that a lot of companies still do, even in spite of how bad of a practice most people know it is the cron jobs are frequently relied on to actually make business automation work. That tends to lead to a lot of failures. If you can, prevent it or avoid it at all costs, that's usually better, because it ends up adding more overhead and also a lot of times more difficulty in troubleshooting from our experience. And then the configuration side, right? I think that it's important to consider that all configuration could be code, but you may not necessarily want to start it out as code. You may need to start it out as something else and then move to code, or vice versa, depending upon where you need the flexibility. So tools that provide both can be very helpful. And actually all the vendor solutions, for the most part, do in terms of what they provide for configuration as code. So that's where it's useful to make sure to evaluate those individual components that you need, though, especially usually given the filtering patterns and logic. Those are the ones where it's most important. Now, one thing a lot of customers struggle with in general, but is important as a part of a practice, I think, to implement for any DevOps, should be maintaining your agents. Your agents, they're generally not updated from a lot of what we've seen for our customers, and the challenge being that you can miss out on key patches or things that could come in to help benefit as far as the telemetry. And we really think that is a consideration. Ongoing planning always should make sure to consider the agents themselves. So as part of the first mile collection, some standardized process for making sure that the agents are updated is really needed. And that's going to actually help potentially minimize your automation if you can do that, because of the new features coming that'll help make it easier, especially in the open source community side when you've got collectors that are not new. So basically focus mostly on your business logic if you can help it. Keep your collectors updated, and that's where you really need to focus on your automation to minimize the overhead. And then the last piece, all of the solutions in terms of the way you approach pipelines. Good question. Let me stop before I go to the next slide. So is it possible to keep the agents up to date through a control plane? So currently, OpenTelemetry does not have, for instance, a control plane, and neither does Vector at this point. Fluent, I'm actually not as familiar. I don't believe they do, but it depends on maybe the way you deploy it. So a lot of the times it ends up becoming something that you right now at least have to manually consider how to do. You can put that inside of the DevOps the CI/CD loop if you can, and make sure that that's included if it's possible, because that way you can actually monitor. That takes usually, though, an individual app level, you have to make sure the dev teams are bought in and amenable to making sure to keep that updated, running the appropriate testing on that, and making sure that that's a part of every time that they potentially do a release, that they're considering adding something for the agent. I think eventually there will be some more control plane things there. OpenTelemetry this year is planning on releasing a beta for their collectors to allow for our control plane. That's just going to be an API. There's no real word of, I don't think there's going to be any kind of a UI on that, but eventually they will get to a one. So I think, if you get ahead now, basically, as I was talking about for the collectors and using them, I think they will catch up, but they're not going to be there yet. Okay, so the last piece here, though, as far as those 4 challenges, right? Tool sprawl. And the good news is when you switch to in-stream and you use any of the solutions actually we've talked about, in general, it's going to be easier to change tools in the individual points in which you use them. The big challenge, of course, is that you won't be able to change your agents quite as easily. If you run it in parallel now with an open source agent with whatever vendor, maybe agents you are using, that would certainly help. And then I think the key thing here is just making sure to choose what you do for your first mile carefully, because regardless of that, once you get the data into a pipeline, putting it into a different tools, you get a much easier chance to migrate or to choose which tools and vendors you want to leverage downstream. But the upstream ones, the source ones, are not. So choose carefully now is the key point, and make sure to test as you go. Use the time if you have some time now, for instance. Most people don't, but try to squeeze it in, right? Use it now to make sure that you test for those particular agents and which ones you want to use, so that you can save time in the long run. Because once you start using a pipeline in general, you're going to be much happier in the long run as part of being able to choose which solutions you get downstream. All right, so in summary, yeah, Josh, this is all great, cool story, but yeah, it's obviously easy to talk about these things. It's hard to actually get them done. Just as a quick review, however, we talked about the 4 major problems, right? Too much data, too little value. You really need to consider how do you remove that in the stream using some kind of filtering, routing, making sure to look at the content and use that as a part of those rules to be able to remove it. If you have apps of their own special flower, which pretty much most of them are, you need to consider how you normalize and transform those app data points to making them something that's within some standard, right? Even if it's just your own internal standard that you can choose to say, hey, this is what we really expect. There are certain standards out there depending upon what kind of data or what kind of apps you get. So maybe those are things that you could also look into. Automation, choose very carefully where to use code, and it's not definitely something that you probably want to use everywhere. Again, if there's particular specific business logic, try to focus on that and make sure that that's the parts where you use the code. And anytime, though, you do a self-managed solution, you're going to need to do something with code control and reversion and all the things that you would normally need with code, because you're going to be managing a lot of that yourself. So put those in place already, because otherwise it's going to be challenging to keep the updates and changes going. And then the final one we talked about was, hey, if you get a growing tool stack, how do you deal with that, right? We're talking about another new tool here, and you're telling me that it's going to reduce your dependence on tools. Yeah, we really believe you. Well, I think the good news is that by going to in-stream and making it something that then, like I said, you have flexibility in choosing which destinations, and there's already a lot of pre-built destinations off the shelf for all the solutions for the most part now. You're going to have flexibility to be able to change out of the destinations as you go. And that doesn't necessarily mean you get a higher flexibility, because the collectors, of course, like we said. But I think in the long run, this will help customers, because we really also want to see reduced vendor dependence and making it so that you could choose who's best for your needs. And if that's Mezmo, that's great. If it's not, then we just want to make sure that you get the right solution. So once you get through this whole path, of course, it's all lakes and lily pads, and everybody should be in a good spot, right? No more problems. It probably won't be, of course, but at least there'll be another problem to solve once we get through this phase. But we do think that moving in stream, and as we see this transition to moving away from storage directly, that it's certainly going to make certain things easier. The obligatory plug for Mezmo. So I mentioned we have a solution, and feel free to follow up and discuss more if you'd like to see it. Our solution is really focused on how do we provide you with an observability pipeline, and observability, again, meaning some of the telemetry where you can take from sources that you have, be able to do operations on the data as it transits through the pipeline, and then send it to a destination that you decide on based upon the characteristics that you wanted to, for instance, filter on and how you wanted to route it. And then if you do need to, you can also still store the data with us and actually analyze it and stream them. So that makes it much simpler to be able to troubleshoot in certain cases, and then be able to get to your destinations. We support the destinations that I see here are shown here on the right, and we're continually adding to those destinations as we build out. We're hoping to make it so that, if there's any specific destination that's not on this list, though, we can develop it rapidly, and if that's something that fits your needs. So we'd love to hear feedback if there's other ones that we are missing, for instance, that you're like, hey, if you just had this, maybe I'd be interested. I'm always open for those kinds of feedback, being the product manager. Okay, I'm all done. I'm going to open it up for any questions. I know we had a couple during the presentation, but are there any other questions beyond?
So Josh, while we wait on just a couple more questions to come in, I do want to go ahead and give away some gift cards. So the 4 winners of our $25 Amazon gift card drawing are Lessa H, Hong L, Austin B, and Dahlia K. So to our 4 winners, congratulations. Keep an eye on your inbox to claim that gift card. It should arrive in about the next 48 hours. If you don't happen to see it, check your spam folder.
Yes, don't want to forget the real reason that everybody showed up to the presentation.
That's right. Well, Josh, I'm not seeing any more questions. So I do just want to give you one more opportunity to leave our audience with any parting words or anything you feel they need to know before we close out.
Well, I think that if there's any words of wisdom that I can offer, it's make sure to do your research on solutions, and make sure to also participate in open source as much as you can. Those are the 2 things that I'll leave with.
Awesome. Wise words, Josh. Thank you so much.
Yep. Thank you, Cody. It's been a pleasure.
So I would like to remind our audience that today's session was recorded. So should you want to rewatch or share with a friend, the on-demand recording will be emailed to you shortly after we conclude. But of course, you can also find it on the DevOps website at devops.com/webinars, and just be sure to look in the on-demand section. I'd like to thank Mezmo for sponsoring our program today. And for everyone who has joined us and the questions that we got, thank you so much for being here and for participating. We really appreciate you, and we appreciate your feedback as well. As soon as we close out, there will be a survey that pops up on your screen. The final question in that survey, you can prompt us for a one-on-one demo with Mezmo. So if you are interested in that, please do check that box and we'll let them know. Otherwise, we do hope to see everyone at a future Techstrong learning experience. Have a great rest of your day. And Josh, thank you once more.
Thank you all. Take care.